June 14, 1944, Philippine Sea, Western Pacific. Aboard the USS Essex, the horizon is nothing but darkness, broken only by the faint hum of engines and the rhythmic tapping of a radioman's key. The air is thick with salt, oil, and tension. Deep in the ship's radio compartment, a young petty officer leans toward a small metal box, no larger than a lunch pail. Its dials glow faintly green. It's simple, crude even. A low-powered transmitter cobbled together from spare parts. To the untrained eye, it's nothing special. But tonight, it will decide the course of fleets. He adjusts a frequency, then presses the key. A pattern of dots and dashes crackles into the night. Meaningless noise to anyone listening. Yet hundreds of miles away, Japanese signal operators aboard cruisers and island stations will intercept it. They'll mark it, chart it, and believe it's coming from a full American task force moving south. But there is no fleet, just a simple radio, built by U.S. engineers to deceive one of the most powerful navies on Earth. The silent war of signals had begun, and Japan didn't even know it. By mid-1944, the Pacific War had entered a new and deadly rhythm. The United States Navy, once reeling from the devastation of Pearl Harbor, now commanded the largest carrier force the world had ever seen. From the Solomons to the Marshall Islands, its ships had carved a relentless path westward. An industrial tide of steel, fuel, and courage. Every island captured became a floating base. Every victory, a new springboard toward Japan's shrinking perimeter. But the Imperial Japanese Navy still held a formidable advantage: knowledge. Its network of radio intercept stations stretched across the Pacific like a spider's web. From Truk Lagoon to Saipan, from Rabaul to Palau, Japanese operators listened, day and night, to the invisible chatter of Allied fleets. Even when American messages were encrypted, their radio patterns gave clues. Direction-finding teams could triangulate sources, track movements, and estimate strength. By studying these signals, Tokyo often knew when, and roughly where, the next Allied assault would come. It was information gathered not by spies or scouts, but by the cold precision of radio waves. To fight back, America needed more than firepower. It needed deception. Inside the Office of Naval Research and the Bureau of Ships, a new generation of American engineers and scientists was quietly rewriting the rules of warfare. They were not soldiers, at least not in the traditional sense. They wore lab coats instead of flight suits, carried slide rules instead of rifles. But their battleground was just as critical. The electromagnetic spectrum. By 1943, the U.S. Navy's research laboratory in Washington, D.C., had begun exploring how radio could be used not just to communicate, but to mislead. The concept was radical. What if a tiny, portable transmitter could imitate the radio signature of an entire task force? What if false messages could trick Japanese analysts into seeing fleets that didn't exist? This was the birth of electronic deception. Across the Pacific, American engineers began experimenting with what sailors jokingly called toy radios, simple transmitters, often made from spare aircraft parts and standard vacuum tubes. They were small enough to fit in a backpack or aircraft fuselage, yet capable of sending signals hundreds of miles. Early versions were crude. Their power output was low, and they required careful tuning to mimic authentic fleet traffic. But they had one priceless advantage: portability. They could be carried ashore by Marines, mounted on submarines, or even airdropped onto remote islands to create the illusion of movement. As U.S. commanders planned their next leap, the invasion of the Marianas in June 1944, deception became more important than ever. Admiral Chester Nimitz wanted the Japanese fleet drawn into open battle, where American carrier pilots could finish what had begun at Midway. But to lure them in, the Japanese had to believe they had found the main American force. That belief would come from a handful of small, seemingly insignificant devices. Simple radios, transmitting phantom signals into the Pacific night. They would be the bait in one of the greatest information traps of the Second World War. The American engineers behind them understood something few had yet realized. In modern war, victory would not only belong to those who could strike the hardest, but to those who could make the enemy strike in the wrong place. And for that, radio waves would become a weapon. The foundation of America's electronic deception effort was built on three simple principles: listen, mislead, and control. By 1943, Allied cryptographers had already turned the tide in the Code War. The Japanese naval code JN-25 was being read regularly by the team at Station Haipo in Hawaii, under Commander Joseph Rochefort. Yet cryptanalysis alone wasn't enough. If Japan could still track Allied fleets by radio direction finding, those advantages could evaporate. So the Navy's scientists and engineers took a new approach. Instead of only hiding transmissions, they would create transmissions, false ones, to flood Japanese intelligence with misleading information. At the Naval Research Laboratory, NRL, a small team led by Dr. A. Hoyt Taylor and physicist Robert Morris Page had already pioneered radar detection systems. Now, they turned that same innovation toward deception. The NRL's experiments with small, low-power transmitters began to show promise. With slight adjustments to frequency and pattern, they could convincingly replicate the traffic of a carrier task force. Call signs, message rhythm, even signal timing. These transmitters didn't carry real messages. They carried illusions. They could make one ship appear as 10, or 10 ships appear as a single force moving elsewhere. At Pearl Harbor, engineers from the Bureau of Ships worked with field technicians to produce portable radio deception sets, some using components from aircraft beacons, others modified from standard Navy transmitters like the AN IRC-1 and SCR-522. Their output power ranged from just 10 to 40 watts, but strategically placed across the ocean, they could simulate powerful fleet broadcasts. By early 1944, these experimental devices began seeing operational use. During preliminary raids in the Marshalls and Carolines, test units were deployed aboard submarines and patrol aircraft. When activated, they sent out controlled bursts of dummy signals, confusing Japanese intercept units that were desperately trying to trace the new American thrust. For Tokyo's analysts, the data didn't add up. Fleets appeared where none existed, and real task forces seemed to vanish overnight. The Imperial Japanese Navy's direction-finding network, once considered a sharp instrument of intelligence, was being blinded by ghosts. Meanwhile, within the U.S. Navy's Fleet Radio Unit Pacific, FRUPAC, cryptologists began integrating deception with intelligence operations. They coordinated fake transmissions to coincide with real coded messages, so that Japanese analysts couldn't separate truth from trickery. Each phantom broadcast was timed and patterned to imitate genuine fleet communications, down to the pauses, key clicks, and rhythm of Morse code unique to American operators. In a sense, it was art disguised as science, an invisible ballet of information warfare. What began as a technical experiment soon became a tactical tool. Commanders at sea realized that false signals could alter the balance of battle. A fake fleet could draw Japanese bombers into open water, away from invasion beaches. A phantom convoy could lure submarines off their patrol lines. Even a single transmitter could mislead entire enemy units if placed correctly. These early experiments would culminate in the summer of 1944, during one of the largest naval operations in history, the invasion of the Marianas. There, the humble, simple radio, dismissed by many as a toy, would help misdirect the Japanese combined fleet at a critical moment. From laboratories in Washington to carrier decks in the Western Pacific, the U.S. Navy had quietly built a new kind of weapon, one that fired no shells, launched no torpedoes, but could turn confusion into victory. The next phase would prove just how. powerful that deception could become. The simple radio that fooled the Japanese. Navy wasn't born from a single design. It was, the sum of 1,000 field improvisations. Across the Pacific, U.S. engineers, technicians, and sailors adapted whatever they had. Spare vacuum tubes, antenna wire from downed aircraft, components salvaged from damaged radar sets. These makeshift devices became the heart of America's growing art of electronic deception. At the center of this transformation stood the Naval Research Laboratory, NRL, and the Bureau of Ships, the two institutions tasked with turning theory into practice. The NRL provided the scientific foundation, understanding how frequencies, timing, and modulation could replicate large-scale radio traffic. The Bureau of Ships translated that science into compact field devices that could survive tropical humidity, vibration, and salt air. By 1944, several models of low-power deception transmitters were in circulation. Some were experimental phantom traffic generators. Others were modified communications sets tuned to specific naval bands. Engineers designed them to mimic the electronic fingerprint of major fleet units. Each carrier group, destroyer squadron, or amphibious task force produced its own recognizable radio pattern, a rhythm of Morse pulses and signal intervals. By analyzing those rhythms, Japanese direction finders could identify units even without breaking their codes. So American engineers turned that principle against them. They studied their own fleet's signal patterns, recorded them, and then reproduced them using these small transmitters. The result was near-perfect imitations of entire carrier groups, ghost fleets roaming the Pacific ether. To make them believable, deception officers layered several transmitters across vast distances. One might be placed aboard a submarine trailing near enemy waters, another mounted on a PT boat, and a third installed on a remote island. Together, their overlapping signals created the illusion of movement, a powerful, coherent radio shadow that Japanese intercept teams would track across hundreds of miles. This was not simply trickery. It was operational art through technology. Each deception plan was mapped with precision. When the real fleet would go silent, when the fake one would broadcast, how often messages would repeat, and even which call signs to reuse from older operations. In some cases, engineers installed automated keying mechanisms, rotating drums that replayed pre-recorded Morse sequences endlessly. The Japanese monitors believed they were tracking genuine fleet coordination, not realizing they were listening to mechanical ghosts. One such unit, known informally as the portable fleet transmitter, became a field favorite. Compact and rugged, it could be set up in minutes and powered by a small generator. On tiny Pacific atolls, U.S. Navy radio specialists used these transmitters to simulate massive carrier operations. When switched on, the Phantom Fleet came to life. Hundreds of fake signals bouncing off the ionosphere, reaching Japanese listening posts as far as Formosa and the Philippines. Even as bombs and shells dominated the headlines, this invisible network of signals reshaped the battlefield. Where the enemy saw fleets, there were none. Where they expected invasion, the sea lay empty. The Japanese analysts couldn't know it yet. But their reliance on radio direction finding, once their strength, had been turned into a trap. And behind that trap stood not admirals or generals, but engineers with soldering irons and slide rules. While American scientists built the technology, it was the sailors, operators, and intelligence officers who gave it purpose. Behind every burst of phantom Morse code stood human hands, trained, disciplined, and often unaware of the full impact of what they were transmitting. In early 1944, a small cadre of Navy communications experts was gathered under the Fleet Radio Unit Pacific, FRUPAC, in Hawaii. Among them were men who had served on frontline destroyers and aircraft carriers, veterans who understood both the chaos of battle and the order of communication discipline. They were instructed to master a new skill, imitating the living heartbeat of an American fleet. They studied authentic carrier traffic patterns, memorized message timings, and even replicated the slight imperfections of different operators' fists, the rhythm and cadence unique to each Morse code sender. The goal was not to send information, but to sound real. For hours each night, these radio men practiced, their headphones filled with static and faint echoes bouncing across the Pacific. They learned to blend frequencies, overlap transmissions, and hand off signals seamlessly between stations. When their broadcasts finally went live, sometimes from hidden outposts on the Marshalls, sometimes from submarines prowling the Philippine Sea, Japanese intercept teams detected exactly what they expected: evidence of a U.S. carrier force moving into position. In Tokyo, intelligence analysts plotted bearings and prepared briefings for Admiral Soemu Toyoda, Commander-in-Chief of the combined fleet. Charts bristled with colored lines marking confirmed American movements. Toyota's staff didn't know that many of those signals came from radios no bigger than a lunchbox, manned by a few enlisted men sweating under red light in a jungle shack. The human element made the deception so believable. Machines could reproduce signal power, but only people could reproduce authenticity. The irregular pauses, the shifting tempo, the instinctive hesitation of a living operator. The Japanese intercept network had grown so accustomed to identifying American units by their operators' Morse habits that when those same habits were perfectly faked, the deception became complete. To the men executing these operations, the mission carried a strange mix of monotony and danger. Their work was secret and often isolated, no medals, no headlines. Yet, they understood its value. A successful deception meant fewer bombs falling on real fleets, fewer Marines facing ambushes, and fewer pilots lost in the Pacific sky. Sometimes the radio crews would learn, days later, that their phantom broadcasts had lured Japanese ships into empty seas. A few lines in an intelligence bulletin would confirm it. Enemy fleet altered course. Contact negative. That was victory enough. The tactical brilliance lay in how seamlessly the deception fit into broader operations. Before each amphibious landing, false fleets would appear hundreds of miles away, diverting Japanese reconnaissance aircraft and submarines. The real invasion convoys, meanwhile, advanced under radio silence, shielded by the static of illusion. In this hidden campaign, no guns fired, no planes launched, but battles were still fought and won. It was the victory of intellect over instinct, of patience over speed. And as the summer of 1944 approached, those invisible victories would converge into one of the most decisive moments of the Pacific War, when phantom signals helped shape the largest naval confrontation in history. June 15, 1944. In the Philippine Sea, the invasion of the Mariana Islands had begun. American amphibious forces stormed the beaches of Saipan under the cover of hundreds of carrier aircraft from Task Force 58, the most powerful naval air armada ever assembled. Admiral Raymond A. Spruance commanded the Fifth Fleet. Admiral Mark Mitcher led the fast carriers. Their objective? Seize the Marianas, cut Japan's southern lifeline, and establish bases from which B-29 bombers could strike Tokyo itself. But to do that, the Americans needed to keep the Japanese combined fleet guessing and away from the invasion beaches. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, commanding from Tokyo, had expected a major American offensive for months. Japanese naval doctrine emphasized Kantai-Kessen, the decisive fleet battle, and Toyoda's strategy, codenamed Operation A-Go, was to lure the U.S. fleet into such an engagement under Japanese terms. His intelligence units had orders to track every American radio signal across the Pacific. They soon began picking up what seemed like the perfect opportunity. From positions near the Caroline Islands and the eastern Philippine Sea, Japanese listening posts detected what appeared to be multiple American task forces maneuvering southwest, far from the Marianas landings. Bearings indicated carrier groups spreading out in classic attack formation. Signal strength, timing, and call signs matched known U.S. fleet units. To Toyota's analysts, the picture was clear. The Americans were preparing a diversionary operation. The real invasion, they concluded, must be coming elsewhere. But the signals weren't from Mitcher's carriers. They were from a handful of small transmitters. Simple radios, operated by Navy communications teams aboard submarines and auxiliary craft. Each device mimicked the unique patterns of American fleet traffic. Coordinated through FRUPAC and guided by radio intelligence, they broadcast decoy transmissions across specific frequencies, shifting tone and rhythm to suggest movement. For the Japanese, direction-finding plots appeared convincing. Bearings intersected at points suggesting large carrier groups converging westward. Yet the plotted task forces were ghosts, their signals echoing from open sea. In the real world, Task Force 58 steamed north toward Saipan under strict radio silence. Every real message was routed through low-powered directional systems to avoid detection. The toy radios were doing the talking instead, hundreds of miles away. On June 18th, intercepted Japanese orders confirmed the deception's success. Toyota committed nearly his entire carrier strength, including 9 fleet carriers and 5 light carriers, to intercept the Phantom forces. They launched Operation Ago, believing they were striking the main U.S. fleet. But they were sailing straight into a trap. While the Japanese fleet raced east toward the decoy transmissions, Mitcher's real carriers positioned themselves to strike. The result, within 48 hours, would become one of the most one-sided naval battles in history. The Battle of the Philippine Sea. The trap was not set with mines or submarines, but with invisible radio waves, proof that America's engineers had learned to fight not only with machines, but with information itself. The morning sky over the Philippine Sea glowed silver blue as the sun rose behind layers of mist. The Japanese combined fleet, under Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, had advanced eastward in full strength. A massive formation of carriers, battleships, and cruisers stretching across hundreds of miles of ocean. They believed they had caught the main American carrier fleet between Saipan and Guam. But the signals they had followed were lies. As the Japanese closed in on Phantom coordinates, Ozawa's scouts searched empty seas. The frequencies that had guided them, so familiar, so precise, faded into static. The task forces his operators had tracked for days were nothing but manufactured echoes, born from those small U.S. transmitters still broadcasting hundreds of miles away. Meanwhile, to the northeast, the real U.S. Fifth Fleet lay in perfect ambush. Admiral Mitcher's carriers, silent and unseen, were launching wave after wave of aircraft. Hellcats, Avengers, and dauntless dive bombers, guided by radar and long-range reconnaissance. At 10 a.m., radar screens aboard the USS Lexington and Enterprise lit up with massive contacts. Incoming raids, hundreds of Japanese aircraft closing fast. American pilots scrambled to meet them in what would later be known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. From the skies above Saipan, U.S. Navy fighters shredded Japan's last elite carrier air groups. Out of more than 350 aircraft launched that day, barely a fraction returned. The once feared air arm of the Imperial Navy ceased to exist within hours. Below the surface, American submarines completed the trap. The Kavala and Albacore stalked the Japanese fleet, striking fatal blows. Taiho, Ozawa's flagship carrier, and Shokaku, one of Japan's most experienced carriers, were sunk in quick succession. As the smoke drifted across the sea, Japanese radio operators began reporting impossible results. Lost contact with supposed friendly fleets, conflicting bearings, no sign of the American task forces they had pursued. By nightfall, Toyota's staff in Tokyo realized the truth. They had been deceived. The simple radios had done their work perfectly. The decoy transmissions, combined with strict U.S. radio silence, had drawn the enemy's focus far from the real invasion area. By the time Ozawa's fleet understood the ruse, it was too late to recover. In the following 24 hours, American dive bombers finished the destruction. Over 400 Japanese aircraft and 3 carriers were lost, the backbone of Japan's naval aviation. The Imperial Navy's ability to wage offensive war vanished with them. The engineers who had designed the tiny transmitters could never have imagined the scale of their impact. Their devices, powered by a few tubes and a portable generator, had misled an entire fleet and reshaped the course of the Pacific. War. What began as an experiment in electronic mimicry ended as a decisive blow, delivered through deception and discipline as dawn broke on June 20th. The sea lay quiet again. Wreckage drifted in the current, while the American fleet moved unopposed toward Guam and Tinian. The Japanese Navy, once dominant, was broken, and much of its downfall had come not from firepower alone, but from invisible signals that told a lie so convincing, it changed history. When the last echoes of battle faded over the Philippine Sea, silence settled on Japan's remaining carriers. Not a strategic silence, but one of loss and disbelief. Reports filtered back to Tokyo in fragments. Taiho gone. Shokaku gone. Hundreds of pilots lost. Thousands dead. And yet, according to the intercepted signals they had once trusted, the American fleet still appeared to exist in several locations at once. It was a devastating psychological blow. A collapse not only of strength, but of certainty. In Tokyo, the Imperial Navy's Communications Division reviewed the intercepted radio logs again and again, unable to reconcile the contradictions. Their once revered direction-finding network, a complex web of listening posts from the Marianas to the Caroline Islands, had been outsmarted by what intelligence analysts described as a low-power broadcast of unremarkable construction. In simple terms, Japan's vast naval machine had been fooled by a toy. U.S. Navy intelligence quickly realized the depth of the victory. Reports compiled after the battle credited Admiral Nimitz's communication security program, led by Commander Joseph Rochefort's successors at Pearl Harbor, for enforcing strict radio silence across operational fleets. The decoy transmissions, originating from remote Pacific islands and a few modified PT boats, had simulated task force chatter so convincingly that Japanese operators logged dozens of phantom movements. Meanwhile, the real American carriers operated like ghosts, invisible, coordinated by encrypted shortwave bursts and radar navigation. Japanese Admiral Soemu Toyoda, who had ordered the A-Go counterattack to save the Marianas, now faced an unthinkable reality. His fleet had not only been defeated, it had been manipulated. The Empire's legendary naval codebreakers and radio analysts had been outclassed by American engineers using equipment so small and so deceptively simple that it barely warranted mention in post-war reports. For the men aboard the U.S. ships, however, the victory was bittersweet. Many had not realized the deception's role until after the battle. Pilots celebrated their air victories, unaware that an invisible signal war had shaped their success before they ever took off. Historians later noted that the radio deception was one of several key factors that made the Battle of the Philippine Sea so one-sided. By forcing the Japanese to commit their fleet prematurely and along false vectors, the U.S. gained both positioning and surprise, two advantages that cannot be quantified but were decisive in combat. In Washington, the Office of Naval Intelligence compiled internal memoranda summarizing the effect of controlled electromagnetic misinformation. They referred to it as a proof of concept, an early example of what future generations would call electronic warfare across the Pacific, the remnants of the Japanese Navy limped home. Fuel was running out. Aircrew replacements were scarce. Their carriers, once symbols of Japan's technological mastery, now sailed half-empty, stripped of their air wings and their confidence. The empire's belief in technological superiority had been shaken to its core. They had learned that power was no longer measured by guns or armor, but by who controlled the unseen spectrum between them, and as Japan's naval command tried to rebuild, they could not know that America's radio deception campaign was just beginning to evolve into something even more sophisticated, invisible, and decisive. In the months that followed the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the lessons drawn from America's radio deception would reshape naval warfare forever. The success of that simple radio, a device assembled from surplus circuits and improvised parts, proved that information, not just firepower, could decide the fate of entire fleets. By late 1944, U.S. Navy research stations from Hawaii to San Diego were conducting classified experiments under the Office of Scientific Research and Development. Their mission was to refine and expand what had just been demonstrated. In the Pacific, electromagnetic control of the Yuan battlefield. What began as makeshift radio, misdirection evolved into structured deception programs. Portable transmitters were mounted on submarines, barges, and even aircraft to imitate large fleets. These devices could mimic communication patterns, radar echoes, and electronic signatures of major task forces. Japanese intelligence, desperate to regain accuracy, fell deeper into confusion. Their analysts no longer knew what was real, or when an attack might come. Behind this silent transformation was a new class of American specialist, the radio warfare engineer. Unlike the celebrated fighter aces or fleet commanders, their work was done in secret rooms, surrounded by vacuum tubes, signal scopes, and endless streams of intercepted code. They were mathematicians, hobbyists, and ham radio enthusiasts turned soldiers. Men who fought a different kind of war, one of silence and deception, among them Lieutenant Commander Gilbert Roberts and his small group of electronics experts in Pearl Harbor began documenting procedures for what they called simulated task force emissions. Their reports outlined how U.S. forces could use timing, frequency variation, and power modulation to fake the presence of entire fleets. These procedures would later influence NATO doctrine and Cold War signal operations. At the same time, the Japanese High Command issued orders to rebuild its communications network. But the empire lacked the resources and materials to compete. Aluminum, copper, and critical vacuum tubes were now rationed. Radar and signal research had fallen years behind. Japanese engineers worked heroically to close the gap. Yet their systems were blind to the Americans' advancing countermeasures. By early 1945, during the invasions of Iwo Jima and Okinawa, U.S. forces employed electronic deception as standard practice. Dummy signals, false radar reflections, and phantom radio nets drew Japanese defenses away from actual landing zones. The concept, first tested in 1944, had matured into a cornerstone of modern warfare. Invisible, disciplined, devastatingly effective. After Japan's surrender, when American intelligence teams entered Tokyo and Yokosuka to examine captured documents, they found stacks of intercepted American transmissions. Most were decoys. Some had been repeated and analyzed for months, even though the ships they described never existed. One Japanese naval intelligence officer reportedly remarked, "We chased the shadows of your machines, but it was your silence that killed us." That single sentence captured the essence of what U.S. engineers had achieved. They had proven that in a war, defined by industrial might and human endurance, the smallest signal could carry the greatest power. A humble transmitter, born from improvisation and curiosity, had become the blueprint for electronic warfare, satellite communications, and modern military deception. And so, long after the last shot was fired, The ghost of that simple radio continued to echo through the wires and frequencies of every future battlefield. History often remembers wars by their tanks, ships, and heroes by the noise and thunder of battle. But the true turning points are sometimes quieter. In 1944, a handful of American engineers, working with what they called a simple radio, proved that intelligence and innovation could outmatch any weapon. They did not fire shells or launch torpedoes. They used silence, patience, and understanding, turning radio waves into an invisible weapon of strategy and deception. The Japanese Navy never fully understood what had happened. Their warships had been blinded not by bombs, but by imagination, by the ability of American minds to use science as a shield and a sword. That small transmitter, born in a workshop filled with spare parts and tired hands, marked a shift in the nature of warfare itself. It was the birth of electronic dominance, a war fought in frequencies, in signals, in the unseen. Decades later, every radar screen, every encrypted satellite link, every stealth aircraft still echoes that lesson. That victory does not belong to the loudest, but to the cleverest. For the U.S. Navy, the simple radio was never truly simple again. It became the heart of a new philosophy, that the mind of an engineer could shape the course of empires. And somewhere, beneath the waves of the Pacific, where signals once danced across the dark horizon, that first pulse of deception still lingers, the faint hum of a revolution born in silence.